When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world breathed a sigh of relief. 4 long years of slaughter had devastated Europe. Empires collapsed, millions were dead, and entire landscapes were scarred with trenches and graves. But even as soldiers returned home and nations tried to rebuild, the seeds of a new, even greater war were already being planted. World War II did not begin in a vacuum in 1939, it was born from the ruins of World War I. To understand how humanity stumbled back into global conflict, we must look at the years between 1918 and 1923, when bitterness, fear, and mistakes shaped the fragile peace. The collapse of old empires. The First World War destroyed 4 mighty empires: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. Their collapse left power vacuums, instability, and unresolved conflicts. Germany, once Europe's powerhouse, was left defeated, its Kaiser forced to abdicate, and a shaky new government, the Weimar Republic, was established. Many Germans saw this not as a proud new beginning, but as humiliation. Austria-Hungary splintered into new states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Boundaries were redrawn, but often without regard for ethnic realities, sowing resentment among minorities. The Ottoman Empire lost its Arab lands to British and French control, creating mandates in the Middle East. New nations like Iraq, Syria, and Palestine were born, but under foreign oversight, not independence. Russia, torn by revolution, plunged into civil war. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had won, establishing the Soviet Union, a communist state that both inspired and terrified the rest of the world. Instead of stability, the collapse of empires unleashed uncertainty. Millions of people now lived in new states, under governments they did not always support, and nationalism simmered across Europe. The Treaty of Versailles, peace or punishment. At the heart of Europe's post-war settlement was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. The victorious Allies, especially France, Britain, and the United States, tried to design a peace that would prevent another war. But the treaty was deeply flawed. For Germany, Versailles was a humiliation. It forced them to accept full blame for the war guilt clause, pay enormous reparations, billions of gold marks that crippled their economy, surrender territory. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France, parts of Prussia went to the new Poland, and colonies were taken overseas. Disarm their military to a tiny fraction of its former strength. To the Allies, this seemed like justice. France, in particular, wanted to weaken Germany permanently so it could never threaten them again. But to Germans, Versailles was a betrayal. They had not thought themselves defeated in 1918, they believed they had agreed to an armistice, not unconditional surrender. The treaty turned this belief into a sense of stab in the back, the idea that weak politicians, not soldiers, had lost the war. This myth poisoned German politics for the next 2 decades. The United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, had hoped for a more lenient peace based on his 14 points, which included self-determination for nations and the creation of a League of Nations. But the U.S. Senate refused to join the League, leaving it weakened from the start. Without American participation, the League lacked the muscle to enforce its ideals. Weimar Republic, a fragile democracy. Germany's new government, the Weimar Republic, faced impossible challenges. On paper, it was a modern democracy with elections, rights, and freedoms. In reality, it was besieged from all sides. The far left, communists, wanted revolution like in Russia. The far right, nationalists, monarchists, and proto-fascists, wanted revenge against Versailles and a return to strength. The middle ground, the actual Weimar leaders, were blamed for everything: the treaty, the reparations, and the economic collapse. In 1920, the Kapp Putsch attempted to overthrow the government from the right. In 1923, the communists attempted uprisings. The most infamous moment came in November 1923, when a little-known agitator named Adolf Hitler led the beer hall putsch in Munich. Though it failed, and Hitler was imprisoned, he used his trial to broadcast his ideas and gained national attention. In prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, laying out his vision for Germany's future. Economic chaos, hyperinflation, and despair. The Weimar Republic's greatest crisis came in 1923. When Germany fell behind on reparations payments, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. German workers went on strike, and the government printed money to support them. The result was catastrophic hyperinflation. The German mark became worthless. Prices doubled by the day. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks in 1919 cost billions by late 1923. Families saw their life savings vanish overnight. Children made kites and toys out of banknotes. People carried wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy food. This trauma burned itself into German memory. For many, democracy became associated with chaos and humiliation. The idea that only a strong leader could restore order began to take root. The rise of extremism across Europe. Germany was not alone in its turmoil. Across Europe, democracies struggled to survive. In Italy, post-war promises had not been fulfilled. Soldiers returned to poverty, and strikes shook the nation. In 1922, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party staged the March on Rome, seizing power. Mussolini promised order, glory, and empire, and many Italians embraced dictatorship as a solution. In Eastern Europe, new nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary emerged, but they faced ethnic divisions and fragile economies. Authoritarianism quickly spread in these young states. In Russia, the victory of the Bolsheviks created a communist regime that alarmed the West. The fear of communism pushed many Europeans to support right-wing movements as a defense against revolution. The world had ended one war, but peace was not secure. The illusion of peace. By the early 1920s, many in Europe and the United States wanted to believe the war had truly ended. Treaties were signed, memorials were built, and promises of never again were repeated. The League of Nations was supposed to guarantee peace, but without strong enforcement, it was little more than a debating club. Meanwhile, bitterness festered in Germany, Italy, and other nations that felt cheated by the post-war order. Economies were unstable, governments weak, and extremist voices grew louder. The world looked peaceful on the surface, but beneath the calm lay anger, fear, and unresolved wounds. The first sparks of a greater fire. In 1923, as Germany reeled from hyperinflation, Adolf Hitler stood in a Munich beer hall and declared that the time had come to overthrow the weak Weimar state. His coup failed, but his words carried into the future. Germany's destiny was not to remain shackled by Versailles, but to rise again. The Great War had ended, but its shadow stretched long. What people called peace was in truth a fragile pause, full of tension and resentment. In the ruins of Europe, the storm that would become World War II was already gathering. The world of the mid-1920s looked, on the surface, calmer than the chaos of 1918. The guns of the Great War had fallen silent, cities were slowly rebuilding, and treaties had been signed to preserve peace. But beneath this fragile calm, the soil was poisoned. The very conditions created by the peace settlements were laying the groundwork for another, even more devastating conflict. Germany's deep wounds. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany crippled. Millions of Germans believed they had been betrayed, not defeated. They had been told by their leaders in 1918 that the war was ending under fair terms, only to face humiliation, the loss of territory, massive reparations, military restrictions, and the hated war guilt clause, blaming them solely for the war. For ordinary Germans, the treaty was more than politics, it was daily suffering. Inflation devoured savings, and jobs vanished. Families that once lived in modest comfort now lined up for bread, carrying baskets of near-worthless currency. Children played with stacks of banknotes because they had more value as toys than money. By the early 1920s, Germany experienced one of the worst hyperinflations in history. Though foreign loans and temporary financial plans, like the Dawes Plan of 1924, stabilized the currency, the scars remained. Every German child was raised with the memory that their parents had been forced to trade dignity for survival. And in that wound, new voices rose, voices promising to restore pride. Italy's discontent and the rise of fascism. Germany was not the only nation boiling with frustration. Italy, although a victor in World War I, felt cheated. Italians believed they had been promised territorial rewards for joining the Allies. Instead, they were given little compared to their sacrifices. Thousands of soldiers returned to poverty, unemployed and embittered. In this anger, Benito Mussolini, a fiery orator and veteran, seized the chance to create something new, fascism. He promised strength, order, and revival. In 1922, Mussolini's March on Rome forced King Victor Emmanuel III to hand him power. The Italian people, exhausted by strikes and instability, accepted dictatorship as the price of stability. Fascism glorified the state above the individual, demanded loyalty, and glorified military might. Mussolini declared that Italy would build a new Roman Empire. For Europe, it was the first warning that democracy was not safe. Dictatorship was back on the stage. The Great Depression, a global earthquake. In 1929, the world economy collapsed. The Wall Street crash sent shockwaves across the globe. Factories closed, banks failed, and millions lost their jobs. The depression hit every nation, but in Germany it was catastrophic. The fragile recovery from Versailles shattered. By 1932, nearly 1 in 3 Germans was unemployed. Desperation drove people toward extremes. In the Reichstag, moderate parties crumbled, while the Nazis and communists surged. People wanted action, not compromise. The Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, promised jobs, bread, and revenge against those who had humiliated Germany. The Depression also hardened other nations. In Britain and France, politicians turned inward, focusing on survival, not foreign policy. The U.S., shattered by its own crisis, retreated further into isolationism. While democracies hesitated, dictators acted. The Nazi ascendancy. Adolf Hitler was no ordinary politician. A decorated World War I veteran, he had spent years building the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazis. With speeches filled with fire and fury, he gave voice to the silent rage of millions. He blamed Jews, communists, and the Treaty of Versailles for Germany's misery. He spoke not only of rebuilding but of destiny, a vision where Germany would rule as a great power once again. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he consolidated power. The Reichstag fire was used as a pretext to crush dissent. Civil liberties vanished. Opposition parties were outlawed. The Third Reich was born. To the world, Hitler claimed peace. But inside Germany, he was preparing for war. The military secretly expanded. Propaganda glorified strength and unity. Children were raised in the Hitler Youth, taught loyalty to the Führer above all. Jews were stripped of rights, setting the stage for even darker crimes. The failure of collective security. While Germany and Italy rearmed, the world looked to the League of Nations for stability. But the League, created after World War I to preserve peace, proved weak and powerless. It had no real army and depended on the will of member nations, nations too divided to act. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. The League protested, but Japan ignored it. By 1933, Japan walked out of the League entirely. The message was clear: aggression would go unpunished. Inspired, Mussolini tested the League next. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent African nations. The League imposed sanctions, but they were half-hearted. Oil and coal, the lifeblood of Mussolini's war machine, were left untouched. Italy conquered Ethiopia with brutal efficiency. The League's credibility collapsed. To Hitler, this was a gift. He saw that the world lacked the will to confront aggressors. Germany breaks its chains. Step by step, Hitler dismantled the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935, he announced rearmament and the creation of the Luftwaffe, Air Force, openly violating the treaty. That same year, he reintroduced conscription, swelling the German army far beyond permitted limits. The world protested but did nothing. Britain even signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935, allowing Germany to build a navy one-third the size of Britain's. It was a diplomatic victory for Hitler, and a signal that Britain hoped to appease rather than confront him. In 1936, Hitler took his boldest gamble yet, remilitarizing the Rhineland. This border region was meant to stay demilitarized as a buffer for France. Sending German troops there was forbidden. But Hitler bet that France and Britain would not respond. He was right. French troops could have expelled the lightly armed German forces, but they hesitated, unwilling to risk war without British support. Hitler later admitted, "If the French had marched, we would have withdrawn with our tails between our legs." Instead, his gamble paid off. German prestige soared. The Axis emerges. By the mid-1930s, dictators were no longer isolated, they were finding allies. Germany and Italy, once rivals, now found common cause in their hatred of democracy and communism. In 1936, the Rome-Berlin Axis was declared, a partnership of fascist powers. Soon after, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, uniting against Soviet communism. A new world order was forming, an alliance of dictatorships opposed by weakened democracies. The stage was set for conflict. By the mid-1930s, the world was sliding toward catastrophe. The democracies of Britain and France still clung to the hope of peace, haunted by the memory of the trenches of World War I. The United States remained distant, unwilling to entangle itself in European affairs. Meanwhile, dictators in Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo acted boldly, sensing their enemies' hesitation. The years 1937 to 1939 would decide the fate of the world. They were the final steps in a journey that led directly to the outbreak of World War II. The war expands in Asia. While Europe's eyes were fixed on Germany and Italy, another storm raged in Asia. In July 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China after the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing. The conflict quickly became one of the bloodiest wars in history. Japanese troops swept into cities, but their campaign was marked by extreme brutality. The most infamous example came at Nanjing, where soldiers massacred civilians and committed horrific atrocities. The event shocked the world, but again, no nation intervened. The war in China drained Japan's resources, but it also hardened its determination. Tokyo's leaders believed Japan's destiny was to dominate Asia. The West, they thought, was weak, paralyzed by fear and unwilling to act. Hitler's next moves. Back in Europe, Hitler was no longer hiding his ambitions. He spoke openly of Lebensraum, living space, for the German people, to be won in Eastern Europe. Step by step, he tested how far he could go without sparking war. 1936. He remilitarized the Rhineland. The Allies did nothing. 1937–38. He prepared for his next target, Austria. The Anschluss, union with Austria. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria, greeted by cheering crowds. The Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, was a direct violation of Versailles, but Hitler justified it as the uniting of all Germans under one Reich. Britain and France protested, but again, they did not act. Many in Britain even sympathized. Was it really wrong for Germans and Austrians, who shared language and culture, to join together? To Hitler, the lack of resistance was confirmation. The Allies would not stop him. The Sudetenland crisis. Next, Hitler turned his gaze to Czechoslovakia, a young democracy created after World War I. Within its borders lived around 3 million ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland, near the German border. Hitler demanded their return to the Reich. Czechoslovakia was strong militarily and backed by alliances with France and the Soviet Union. War seemed possible. But Britain, led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperately wanted to avoid another bloodbath like World War I. In September 1938, leaders met in Munich: Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and French Premier Daladier. The Czechs themselves were excluded from the talks about their own future. The result was the Munich Agreement. The Sudetenland was handed to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise of no further territorial demands. Chamberlain returned to London declaring he had secured peace for our time. But in truth, Munich was a disaster. Czechoslovakia lost its defenses, the Allies lost credibility, and Hitler learned that appeasement worked. The destruction of Czechoslovakia. Only months later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise. German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was different from Austria or the Sudetenland. It was not about uniting Germans, but about conquest. The world now understood Hitler's true aim: domination, not just reunion. Even Chamberlain realized appeasement had failed. Britain and France promised to defend the next likely target, Poland. Italy's ambitions. Meanwhile, Mussolini sought his own glory. In April 1939, Italy invaded Albania, a small Balkan nation. It was a symbolic act, showing that Mussolini was determined to expand Italy's influence alongside Hitler. The Rome-Berlin Axis, once just words, was now a real partnership. Fascist powers were marching in step. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, a shocking alliance. As Hitler prepared for his most dangerous move yet, an invasion of Poland, he faced a problem. If he attacked, Britain and France might intervene, and Germany could find itself fighting a two-front war if the Soviet Union opposed him. The solution was stunning. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The world was shocked. Fascist Germany and Communist Russia had been bitter enemies, yet now they pledged non-aggression. Secretly, they agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be carved up, and the Baltic states would fall under Soviet control. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler was ready for war. The invasion of Poland. On September 1, 1939, Germany launched a massive invasion of Poland. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was unleashed, tanks, planes, and mechanized infantry striking with speed and coordination. Polish defenses collapsed rapidly under the assault. 2 days later, on September 3, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. Why appeasement failed. The outbreak of war was the result not only of Hitler's aggression but also of the West's failures in the 1930s. Britain and France had tried appeasement, hoping to buy peace with concessions. But appeasement only emboldened Hitler, convincing him the democracies lacked the will to fight. The League of Nations, meant to prevent conflict, had failed at every test: Manchuria, Ethiopia, Spain, Austria, Czechoslovakia. Without enforcement, collective security was an empty phrase. The trauma of World War I had made the Allies too cautious, too slow, and too unwilling to confront aggression early. By the time they realized war was inevitable, Hitler had already grown too powerful. The world at the brink. By late 1939, the stage was set for a global conflict even greater than the last. Hitler believed destiny was on his side. Mussolini prepared to join when the moment was right. Japan was locked in brutal war with China. And the Soviet Union, despite its hatred of fascism, had chosen pragmatism and signed a pact with its greatest enemy. The world was divided into camps: the Axis powers, driven by expansion and dictatorship, and the hesitant democracies now forced into war. World War I had been called the war to end all wars. But less than a generation later, humanity had stumbled into a second, even more devastating conflict. The period between 1918 and 1939 had not prevented war, it had paved the road to it.